A couple weeks ago, I read an article that I have concluded is probably the worst take on open source software that I've ever seen. Not only does he say for the developers of open source software that it is a complete waste of time, but for the users, he has referred to open source software as the poor man's version of an actual software. So I think this would be a fun article for us to go through and read, see if he makes any good points, and then point out some of the facts that he claims that are obviously based on falsehoods and opinions, and that just overall lack credit in research, and it lacks an overall understanding of open source software as it sits. So let's get started. So the article is titled Why I Dislike Open Source. And he starts off with open source model is a bad idea for the most part. One can come up with 1 or 2 reasons why open source is good, but for each of those reasons, I can give you 20 reasons why it is not just a bad idea, but an entirely ludicrous idea. To go through all these reasons, one needs to write a book, but since I'm not interested in writing a book about the obvious, I will simply list a few reasons why I do not do open source and why I believe it is a complete waste of time. Now, that initial paragraph kind of tells us most of what we already need to know in how this person is viewing open source and their statements. The absolute sensationalism throughout the article and the fact that it appears, now this is just, me as a reader, it appears that this individual is just trying to poke at people who really like something by talking negatively about it in order to get more eyes on their article. And I'm not here to try to attack Leo, who is the author of this article, by any means. I just want to kind of address some of the falsehoods and some of the claims that he made in this article so we can learn a little bit more about open source together. So why don't we go ahead and get started? They are mostly, 99% of the time, inferior to their proprietary counterparts. So he is saying that open source software is inferior 99% of the time to their proprietary counterparts. GIMP is inferior to Photoshop, Blender to 3ds Max, Modo, Maya, ZBrush, LMS is inferior to FL Studio, and Godot is inferior to Unity. Okay, so taking this is really just us assuming that he has used all of these products extensively, because the only reason you can say one thing is better than the other, you have to understand that both things. That's why there are plenty of bands that I don't like, but I know the words to every single one of their songs, is because the reason I know I don't like them is because I have heard and listened to their songs and I've come to the conclusion that I don't like them. Not them as a people, but the music that they make. So we have to assume that out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and the list goes on, but just out of the 11 products here that he has used them extensively, which he provides no proof for, and even if you think some of these claims are true or not, that's beside the fact. But I do want to point out, what about GitHub itself? So we have the Linux repository right here. This is on GitHub, which is open source. GitLab is not open source. Some components of it are, but GitLab is not open source. Bitbucket, commercial software, not open source. Which is better? Microsoft VS Code. I understand it is by Microsoft, but this is still open source software. He did not specify open source that is created by Joe Schmo and Jane Doe over there. He's talking about open source as a whole, regardless of who it is made by and how many contributors that it does have. So, based on what I know, VS Code is the best text editor that you can get. It's better than Atom, which is owned by GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft. It's better than Sublime Text. It is better than all of those other text editors, other than maybe, Notepad++, of course. And then Vue, React, all of these other repositories that we have on GitHub, the GitStar ranking. We have Microsoft Terminal, we have Angular, we have, I just saw one, Node.js. And obviously a lot of the open source software is going to be made for developers because it's made by developers as like a passion project or something. But I don't want to spend too much time on this point. Oh yeah, WordPress CMS. 41.4% of the top 10 million websites as of May 2021 uses WordPress, which is free and open source CMS. So just to boldly claim they're mostly 99% of the time inferior to their proprietary counterparts is just false. But then he goes on, in fact, open source software is the poor man's version of an actual software. Hold up. Let me let me gather myself after that statement. Let us just say it is the Audi version of real software. Wherever you find open source software, they feel like and look like the knockoff version of the real thing. What about VS Code and everything else that I just laid out? And should I say it? Yes, Linux is inferior to Windows and Mac. But how? He doesn't make any actual points as to why he thinks that or how it is better than the alternative. So we'll just take his word for it, I suppose. But I do want to address this point right here. In fact, open source software is the poor man's version of actual software. Just because something is free does not mean that thing is worse than what you pay for. I mean, have you ever heard of CoffeeZilla on YouTube? He exposes all of these different scams where all of these different gurus are selling courses for $2,000 for basic knowledge that you can have on YouTube. So are you telling me that because that course is worth, or not worth, but he's selling it for $2,000 is better than what you can get on YouTube for free? That is just one of many examples that you can make about something that is free versus something that is paid, because that argument of open source software is a poor man's version of an actual software, which you're saying because the poor man uses this open source software because it's free, is just wrong. Now, on to the next paragraph, because this is just, I mean, it's hard to try to argue someone who isn't making any points to their opinions. Their standards are too low. So he's saying the open source software standards are too low. This is similar to the above example. When there are no barriers or gatekeepers, no boss to keep you on track, no interviews to screen out weak links, no supervisors to right your wrongs, and no one to get you fired, etc. There's no wonder why the open source community, in quotes, has attracted some of the worst developers. Hold up. All right, before we move on, let me just address those two things, because that's a lot going in there. One, when there are no barriers or gatekeepers, pull requests. Pull requests. There's a whole reason why there's this tab right here on the Linux repository. Every other repository that you see, issues, pull requests. That is because when someone changes something or adds something or implements a feature or takes care of one of these issues that there are, they have to submit a pull request. And then once that pull request is submitted, there are levels that it has to go through in terms of testing, in terms of seeing if this is something that they actually want to add to the repository, so on and so forth. So to say that there are no barriers or gatekeepers, that is quite literally what a pull request is. So I don't mean to attack you, Leo, but if you've been programming for 2 decades and you don't know what a pull request is, that's not a good sign. And then he comes in to say, where is it? Oh yeah, that the open source community has attracted some of the worst developers. I don't know if this is his anecdotal experience or what, but I've actually seen the opposite. Most individuals who are really bad developers do not contribute to open source, and if they do, and they are bad developers, and what the code that they wrote are bad, then it's not going to make it into the final repository due to the pull requests. So that argument is just false based on my own anecdotal experience, which is in contrast to his anecdotal experience. From first day boot campers to experienced developers who are just ill-adapted for the sport can simply join most projects and contribute. It is a laughable model. Again, pull requests, you can attempt to contribute. You can have your own forked repository that is under your own, but it's not the official repository of Linux or VS Code or Vue.js, so on and so forth. The next point he makes is that there's no protection of intellectual property. Oh, but there are different licenses that give you different permissions, blah, blah, blah. The real question is, who enforces this? There have been countless times where criminals under the guise of developers have shoplifted other people's code, slightly altered it, sold it, made money from it. Nothing happened. I have even heard of paid versions of Blender. The problem is the very idea of open source makes original developers vulnerable to this mess. Not only can someone steal your work and make money from it, they can do so without giving you credit. Okay, Leo. We have found a bit of common ground. Now, the way you presented it with, really just trying to get under people's skin is not how I would have presented it, because I don't care about getting under people's skin. But what I will say is that it's true. I mean, if you're going to be putting your code out there, you may have a license, but an individual can take that and use it as their own, even if it is illegal, because not only do you have to catch them, you have to then enforce your license through whatever government that you have, assuming that they are in the same country as you, or that their government or your government recognizes these software licenses. So I will say that if you are going to be coding something that is open source, and even if it does get big or just stay small, don't be surprised if someone decides to steal it from you, because the code is right there for the taking, regardless of how many licenses you have on it. Now, if you care to dispute that for one reason or another, you want to enlighten me, then go ahead. It's just that's what I've seen. You have to see someone using your code, or someone has to see someone then tell you that is using your code, and you have to know that that is your code. And how are you going to know that unless their stuff is open source? It's this whole deal. But yeah, I will agree with that. Okay. A toxic community or cult. Even the phrase open source community itself is a joke. For those of you, I know I have a lot of new programmers who watch this channel. I have been in this space for a very long time, and I've never heard that the phrase open source community itself is a joke, ever. So this is just not a true claim. I have seen lots of times where self-proclaimed 10x devs just sit and bash other people's code. A community that's supposed to help bad or inexperienced coders will make you feel so bad by mocking you for writing bad code. This sounds a bit more like Stack Overflow rather than the open source community at large. There is even a subreddit for bad code. This is a counterproductive and self-defeating way of trying to promote this quote-unquote community. Now again, a lot of this really we can link my Stack Overflow video right here where I kind of rip into them, but that's basically what that paragraph is stating. It's all about Stack Overflow. In fact, I've heard more good things about the open source community than bad things. I have, in Leo's defense, I have seen one comment on that Stack Overflow video where they said this is actually the same exact experience that I got in the open source community as many of us have experienced with the Stack Overflow community, kind of just bashing you and berating you for asking a stupid question or writing bad code or whatever. I have seen one individual make that comment. I understand that it happens, but my personal experience, which that is exactly what you're talking about, is your personal experience, it's the opposite. So that is hard to argue given it's all personal experience and kind of how you entered the open source community, if you will. But again, I see most individuals being positive rather than negative. Programmers should eat, or maybe I should say good programmers should eat. Pushing this idea that people should sit in front of the computers and code all day just to get some pat on the back by some code bros or to get some GitHub stars is senseless. I've never heard anyone, as a matter of fact, push the idea that you should sit in front of your computer all day and code just for some gratification from other people or just to get some more GitHub stars. Most people who do this and contribute to open source projects who aren't quote unquote eating, which what he means by that is getting paid, is because they just enjoy doing that. And if they enjoy doing that, I don't see the problem. Okay, we know some people get into programming to lift themselves from poverty. Sure, some of these people are just not cut out for programming, while some of them are. I think just like every other profession, actors, musicians, doctors, lawyers, etc., programmers deserve to charge good money for their work. Although, and this is where he really tries to jab you, given the fact that most projects on GitHub are an absolute joke, most people might argue against or ignore this point. Back when I read this a couple weeks ago, I do remember that, because I think this individual has the understanding of GitHub and open source projects all wrong. It appears that his understanding of it are your little projects that you create during a tutorial and you put it up on GitHub because that's just, you're learning version control and whatnot, and that's his whole ideal. Like, that's why he thinks the way he does about open source, which doesn't make any sense, because the open source projects that he mentioned and the open source projects that are actually software spread out to the masses and people who are actually using it are not these tutorial to-do lists. They're not these little games that you make or these terminal applications that you make while you're learning. It appears that that's his understanding of GitHub and open source projects as a whole. If you want to make money coding, cool. If you want to code as a hobby, cool. What does it matter? Lack of support. I mean, what did you expect? A young Mr. Lee who built a cool, promising open source software as a new graduate at the time now needs money for that project he has been working on for 3 years. The illusion of coding for free all day because of passion has now been exposed. Okay, so he's addressing exactly what I just said. Bills need to be paid and new clothes need to be bought. Also, he has no girlfriend because he cannot even pay for a date at Starbucks, so he finally abandons that software and moves on to get a job. So this entire paragraph just to say that it lacks support. So let me try to dissect this a little bit. Mr. Lee, he uses Mr. Lee while his name is Leo. And he talks very specifically about some of these day-to-day aspects. It sounds like he's talking from experience. Okay. I'm being a little mean here. Let's look at this from a logical standpoint. So, most individuals who work on a passion project for 3 years, it would be nice to get paid from that, but it doesn't mean that they expect to get paid from that. If you're building open source software, you're typically not too worried about getting paid from that. That is why you do other things to make money. Most individuals who do work out of passion or as a hobby, they're not looking to make money. And if they are looking to make money, then they probably won't make it open source. That's typically how it works. All of this is just kind of funny. Anyway, security issues. Oh, this is a big one. Open source software are known to be very insecure and not trustworthy? What did you expect? You didn't even pay for it. And hold on, who do you even hold responsible for damages? What are you talking about? This is quite literally why most people use Linux, which is open source, or a lot of these other open source softwares, because security is better than proprietary software. Because the code is open source, that you have all of these different eyes looking at the code, looking for vulnerabilities. And if there are vulnerabilities, then they will typically get patched in the beta version before it gets pushed to something that will be delivered to you and I. And that is why the beta version is available in so many different types of software, so that you can find these vulnerabilities and these security issues. So imagine if you had 1,000 people, 1,000 sets of eyes looking at a code base versus a team of 10 or even a team of 20 or even a team of 100 set of eyes looking at a code base. And then even more people testing out the open source software versus a proprietary version. Who's going to patch more security issues and who is going to leave more security issues that they did not see because they didn't use that software in a particular way? That's just my long version of saying that it is pretty well known, actually, the opposite of this sentence right here. Open source software are known to be very insecure and not trustworthy is in fact the opposite. Open source software is incredibly popular because it is incredibly secure. So, well, there's that. Can I see your code, bro? LOL, just about every developer in the open source cult believes that any software out there, especially ones written by a small team or a solo developer, should be open source. Interesting. The sense of entitlement and the desperation to see other people's source code is getting more and more frightening. I'll tell you how to respond to these people. Do not tell them reasons why you cannot make your project open source. Just ignore them entirely. So, I don't know what open source cult he is a part of. However, I will say that I have announced projects that I've built on the channel. You have Ben Awad, who announces and builds a new project every other month, it seems like. And then you have all of these different people on Indie Hackers talking about their projects and whatnot. And not a single time in any of my comments, his comments, or their comments have I seen people complain that this project is not open source. In fact, the only thing that I have seen from someone who contributes to open source is saying, hey, I know this isn't open source, but if you ever do decide to make it open source, I'd love to contribute. That's a nice statement. That isn't some, can I see your code, and the sense of entitlement and desperation to see other people's source code is getting more and more like, this is just not true, at least in the communities that I've been a part of. So, I mean, if you're talking about proprietary software and how you're building proprietary software to a purely open source community, well, then why are you there? Because if you see, there's a disconnect there. Because if you're building proprietary software, okay, I think y'all get what I'm trying to say. More problems with large and legacy code bases. Large legacy software require a team of people that have worked together on the project for a very long time. People who understand the history of the code base and who can navigate the large code base. Wait, I don't think that was a complete sentence. Let me reread that. So he's saying, referring to the legacy software, people who understand the history of the code base and who can navigate the large code base. Okay, that was difficult. Open source does not have the means, pay, company culture. Oh, he's a company family man. Okay, we need to get Joshua Fluke over here. Teach him a lesson. Hierarchy, to keep a team of talented developer for a long time. These are the reasons why things fall apart and projects get abandoned. Okay, so to address this, you are really assuming that the large legacy software, like all of these proprietary software projects, have the same developers on it day in, day out, and that they don't jump ship from one company to another or one project to another, or the teams don't switch projects from time to time. This one comes over from India and you send your project over to the team in India. That is actually a very common thing that happens in a lot of these big companies. So I don't really understand the argument here, because there's not really much of an argument since it's just not true. How many people are actually on a lot of those projects that are proprietary for a very long time? I mean, can you really prove that there are more people that have a better understanding of a proprietary code base than those that have understanding of this code base right here? I don't think you can make that argument factually. I really don't. And he concluded this article with, well, before we read that, can you just leave a like on this video, subscribe if you like coding content and computer science content and that type of stuff, because I feel like a lot of you are going to dislike the video after this because it's going to feel like a big waste of time after reading this last paragraph, his conclusion, because what we suspected through and through was spot on. Honestly, I could write a book on this, which we know, you've already told us that. Open source itself is just flawed and works for only specific types of projects or very small learning projects. Feel free to post your game jam projects or that juicy to-do app you just built using your new favorite language. So obviously, we knew that this individual was just trying to be real negative about something that a lot of people like to try to get a lot of eyes on his article. But also that assumption we made about his understanding of open source altogether is spot on as well. Because right here it says open source, and he's referring to open source as a very small learning project or a to-do list app that you created because you're trying out a new programming language, which, as we know, is not open source. What is in fact open source is this and this and this and this and all of these repositories. That is really what we're getting at when we talk about open source, and especially open source projects, which it appeared that he had an understanding of all of this when he was talking about GIMP and, Blender and some of these other actual open source projects. But all of these little tutorial apps or the to-do list app that you create to learn a new language, you just happen to put on GitHub. That is not the software that we are comparing to proprietary software, which is the reason why I said the majority of this article is based on falsehoods. So again, I hope I didn't waste your time with this article. I just wanted to shed a little bit of light on open source and some of the misconceptions, if any of this is even real, the misconceptions of open source software and the community and some of those other aspects that we kind of went over in this article. And I hope you took something away from this video in regards to open source. And that's it. I hope y'all enjoyed this video, liked it if you did, subscribe if you want more content, maybe not like this, but overall regarding computer science, software engineering, that type of stuff. That's what I do on my channel, so subscribe or hit the bell if you're already subscribed, and I'll see y'all here soon. I think I have another video coming this week. Fingers crossed.